Welcome everyone to my presentation, Ship Happens, Now What? On the experiences of 3D scanning maritime archaeological objects and possible applications. I feel honored that Batavialand was chosen to host this year's EXARC symposium. So without further ado, let me get started. And the structure will be as follows. I'll talk a bit about who I am, my background, but also what I work with, the National Maritime Archaeological Collection, Batavialand, what Batavialand does, and in what way it is related to the shipwrecks. And mainly I want to focus on our experiences with the Artec Leo 3D scanner and the good and the bad things that we ran into while using it for the first time, basically. And then I'd like to zoom out a little bit and discuss some possible applications for 3D models regarding research, usually archaeological, but also some stuff that might be of use for a museum or educational perspective. Of course, I'm going to be looking at it from a more maritime archaeological perspective, so I invite you to assess with which aspects are relevant to your particular interests. Who am I? I am the curator of the National Maritime Archaeological Collection, Joran Smale. I've been working at Batavialand for about 6, almost 7 years. And my background is in archaeology at Leiden University here in the Netherlands. But when it comes to 3D scanning, I'm very much not an expert. So I came into this as a novice. So using the Artec Leo was very much a learning experience. Batavialand manages the National Maritime Archaeological Collection, which comprises of roughly 40,000 artifacts, of which about 2/3 were reclaimed from land excavations and 1/3 come from underwater excavations. And it is strongly focused on the wooden shipwrecks of the past, from Roman shipwrecks all the way up to wrecks from the early modern period. Batavialand itself, of course, is named after the Batavia, a very large reconstruction project of which you can still visit the result today here in Lelystad, and it consists of a museum and a shipyard, and the shipyard focuses more on traditional crafts, and I think it's the intersection of maritime archaeology and this craftsmanship that creates possibilities for experimental archaeology. And usually nowadays this has been in the form of making replicas of artifacts for educational and experimental purposes, but also a larger project in which we are reconstructing a 16th century fishing vessel called a waterschip. And that's some of the experimental archaeology we are. Batavialand itself, of course, is situated on a bit of a peculiar location on the sea floor. Here you see on the left a map with how the area used to look before the land was reclaimed. And the province of Flevoland was created as a result of a series of polders, which of course led to the emergence of a lot of shipwrecks in the soil, more accessible than ever for archaeological research, starting around the middle of the previous century. Here on the left you can see a bit of what that looks like. You don't have to go very deep. And in Flevoland there have until now been around over 400 excavations on land alone, which usually yield lots and lots of artifacts. But that also brings with it a considerable conservation workload, and the ships themselves, of course, are very large, complex and multi-layered 3-dimensional objects in and of themselves. Now these wrecks are almost always deformed and incomplete, so reconstruction is always a necessary aspect of doing research into these ships when you are excavating one. Now the process of excavating is of course temporary, usually a couple of weeks, maybe some months, but after that, if the ship is not preserved, it is usually removed, and all we are left with is the documentation documentation consisting of photos, drawings, and of course now in modern times, usually also scans and models and stuff using newer technology. Which brings me to our week with the Artec Leo device. The Dutch Cultural Heritage Agency was gracious enough to allow us to, for a week, use the Artec Leo alongside a laptop with the necessary software, and use it to basically get a feel for it, do some scanning, and that's basically what we did with it. We wanted to get a feel for the process and the technology. Here on the right you can see my volunteer Frank Posma, who is scanning what turned to be one of the more easy types of objects to scan, ceramic vessels. On the left, a ship's figurehead. And I'd like to show you some of the results. The ship's figurehead came out quite good, actually. I was a bit worried about the surface texture, but came out pretty good. But of course we wanted to try objects of different materials just so we could see how the results would turn out. And pretty soon, when we started publishing these models on Sketchfab, we also experimented a bit with the background, adding some old images, or as you can see on the bottom right, an excavation photograph, giving you a bit of a background to see where the object was originally found in the ship. And of course, all of these you can move around freely in the Sketchfab. Some of the upsides we discovered: you can see the object from all sides. Scanning goes pretty quick, maybe 10 to 15 minutes per object, I'd say. It's turned out to be easier than photogrammetry. And the resulting models, of course, are easier to share than physical objects themselves, especially when they are more fragile or unstable. And of course, the resulting data and models can be used for other things, applications such as collections, viewers, and games, etc. We also discovered some downsides, technical limitations that this particular type of device runs into. For example, the object on the top left, the angle wasn't right for us to get the bottom part of the top compartment right there. So when creating the model, it basically filled in the gap, creating a bit of a bulge. Then the object next to it is supposed to comprise of several layers on the end there, but it couldn't really identify them properly, and it kind of fused them together, unfortunately. And then on the bottom, you can see an object that was very fragile, and so we were unable to turn it around and scan the bottom side of it. And so in this particular example, we had the software kind of extrapolate the underside based on the surrounding area. Now, of course, when you do this and you publish these results, I think this creates a need for descriptive metadata. You need to basically very much explain how the model was generated and which peculiarities are associated with the way it was generated, so that people don't get a wrong idea about the object. Now, some ways you could apply the resulting models, zooming out a bit into 3D models in general. On the left, you can see a 3D application used to basically allow you to virtually walk around a 17th century vessel, a Dutch vessel, which allows you to bring up information about the location where you are on the ship, or the particular thing that you're looking at, which is kind of similar to what Sketchfab allows you to do, which you can see on the right. We have a musket from a shipwreck. We scanned it, and we added an annotation. In this case, on the stock of the gun, there was an inscription. Then it's also already being used for research and documentation a lot. On the left, you can see the excavation of a water ship, with 2 years in between. This year they finally uncovered the whole ship, but they were able to scan a previous stage of the excavation as well. And in documenting these excavations, also different tools are used. For example, you can see my colleague Frank Dalmeijer in the middle at the top using the Faro arm device, which basically allows you to trace a particular object and then mark points in 3D space that will you can eventually turn into a model. The Artec Leo was also used to great effect when last year there was an excavation on a wreck that in the Dutch Wadden Sea, where they brought up ship's timbers, scanned them with the Artec Leo, and then without having to make the timbers undergo a long conservation process, put them back underwater while still having gathered all the data about them. At the bottom you can see the same Faro device being used for scanning a scale model of the ship that we're now building in full size, the water ship, based also on the arc. And you'll see it again here in the middle, allows you to create these very wonderful looking models, but also to it allows you to do some calculations with them, or even simulations. Here in the middle you can see calculations on the volume of the ship. On the right you can see how Pat Tanner did research on, for example, the Newport medieval ship, and he's very much able to use software to simulate, for example, the stability of a vessel. On the left, the actual 3D spatial data was used to verify a very old archaeological drawing of an old ship excavation. That already brings me to the end. I'd like to end with some remarks. If all of it sounds a bit too complicated for you, which honestly I can understand, you can try to use some phone apps to basically get a feel for the process. Maybe you can see if you can borrow or share a device in the same way that we did, borrow it for a week. Do take note that the things that you're making are in a durable file format, preferably open source, but also accompanying them with the useful and needed metadata, which I referenced earlier, like describing how the model was formed, which imperfections it might have, and of course the model is usually not perfect. If you're not satisfied, you can usually go back to the source data and try again, or you can go back to the object and try to scan it again. But of course, the important thing is to keep trying, referencing, of course, this nice image on the top right. That brings me to the end of my short presentation. I'd like to say thanks to everyone listening, and of course the people on the screen here. And anyone who would like to reach out to me, please let me know. I put my email there in the beginning. Thank you.